everyone, my name is Kim Wells, and I'd like to welcome you to RGD's webinar, Understanding the Rules, presented by Hilary Ashworth, Executive Director at RGD, Julian Brown RGD, designer and entrepreneur at On the Chase and VP of RGD's Ethics Committee, and Stüssy Tschudin RGD, founding principal of Forge Media and Design and president of RGD. Before we begin, just a few reminders. If you have any questions, please submit them using the Questions tab in the webinar control panel. Also note that questions can take a while to come through the system and are more likely to be addressed if submitted during the presentation. Questions that come through will be collected and answered throughout and at the end of the presentation. We also invite you to interact with us on Twitter by tweeting during and after the broadcast using the hashtag RGDWeb. So welcome and thank you all for coming. If you're ready, I'll turn it over to you guys.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for participating today. Before we get started going through all of the rules, I just wanted to alert everyone about the sort of format and a bit about the process for the rules generally. As hopefully everybody knows, as part of RGD's certification process, the rules are one section on the online test portion of the certification, and with about a 75% passing mark required. And the rules themselves, it's open book and multiple choice, so you have the opportunity to have the rules in front of you with notes as well. And you can download the rules both in the resources section under ethics or in about. And just to go over the overall format, there are 4 sections generally for each rule. The policy refers to the very specific required behavior, ethical behavior of our members at every category of membership. And those policies can be if someone, whether a member or non-member, feels that one of our members has broken or infringed upon one of those policies, there is a process which is outlined in the RGD general bylaw whereby a grievance can be initiated against an RGD, and there's a whole process that's outlined in the bylaw that goes through that if you're interested in finding out more specifically about that. From there, we added a section of best practices. So these are recommended behaviors, what we encourage members and non-members as well to engage in for just a best practice for professionalism in the industry. But we don't actually have a grievance process for those best practices. Then we've also created some situational examples. In a lot of cases, they're sort of based on real situations that we've come across during our questions from members and actually specific grievances. And then we've also included some references that relate to RGD materials and resources that can help to address situations and help with best practices in behaving professionally and ethically. So from there, I guess I will turn it over to Stüssy so he can go through the first rule.
All right, so the first rule, the first rule is I'm committed to meeting the professional standards of the graphic design industry and working towards the betterment of the profession across Ontario, Canada, and internationally. What does this essentially stand for? First and foremost, it means uphold the laws of the province, of the country, but also uphold the RGD bylaws, which are very specific to the graphic design industry, obviously. When working internationally, obviously we have to follow international laws, but also while respecting, at the very least, also the RGD rules, because sometimes the rules are stricter than some of the international laws. There are a few other items in case of, like, if you have a company, if you run a company and there is a bankruptcy, you will obviously have to notify the RGD about that status, so things can be updated on the RGD website. You have to pay your membership dues, which actually acts as an annual renewal of your commitment to follow these rules, which is good to kind of also use that opportunity to reread the rules and really make sure you're always familiar with what the rules are all about. Now, those are some of the policies. On the best practices side, obviously we encourage all our members to always use the RGD designation, whether that's on email sign-off or that's on a company website, in filling out proposals, plus also like be proud of your RGD certification and put up your certificate up at your place of work. If you're an employee, I'm sure your employer will gladly let you put it up within your work area. If you're a company owner, we put them up right at our entrance area in the lobby. It gives people something to look at while they're waiting for a meeting, and we find it gives us legitimacy. It gives clients the comfort of understanding they're going to be working with a true professional graphic designer, which is good for everybody involved. And in order to be a good RGD, we also encourage all the RGDs to continuously strive to uptake professional qualifications, attend workshops, webinars, conferences, learn more about how to be a better graphic designer on an ongoing basis. This will help to increase the level of graphic design we can offer as RGDs across the board, and it will ensure that we're always on top of the latest and greatest when it comes to things like accessibility, for instance. And yeah, that sort of sums up the first rule. Julian?
Actually, before we move on, we did have a question, and I think, so I'll just, I won't read the exact question because Kim has it in front of her, but it's a very good question. It relates to rule number 1, and it asks why we are specifying Ontario in the first rule when we do have members in BC and outside of Ontario. So that's a very good question. As I would imagine many of the participants know, we were created by an act of the Ontario Legislature. It's a government act, and with legal advice, we are aware and committed to expanding our resources and what we have available and the services that we provide and the community that we represent, to expand that beyond Ontario and across the country. And this questioner makes a really good point, and I think it relates to the document as a whole. I mean, we're partly doing this webinar and partly involving the community in this discussion because this is a working document. This is something that we hope will be brought to the membership every year at our annual meeting and reviewed and revised and modified to meet the changing challenges of our industry and to help us to grow and be representative of our entire community. So I think that's a really good point to make, and certainly at our next ethics committee, we have Julian is the VP of Ethics. He represents a group of members that meet about once a month to discuss specific advocacy issues when it comes specifically to spec, but also just to review the rules and make modifications. So we will definitely be discussing this at our next meeting and possibly remove that specificness of the first rule.
Great, thanks, Hilary. You took the words right out of my mouth. I was just going to specify that about the committee and like this being a working document and it's constantly updating and constantly trying to keep current with the rest of the industry. I really think that just speaks to the origins of the association and where we were when we began and first wrote these rules. So moving on to rule number 2, Stüssy and I are going to ping pong back and forth here to try to cover everything. He gave a very thorough and well-spoken summary of the first one. If I can get, I'm not in control of the slideshow, but I hope people can see the rule number 2. Okay, thanks. So rule 2, I will engage in the practice, management, and or instruction of graphic design in an ethical and lawful manner. So this rule covers your responsibilities to your fellow designers, whether they're your peers, your employees, or your students. It covers things like not unfairly criticizing or stealing jobs away from other designers, not lying about your own work or your experience in order to promote yourself. And it also covers student internships and how students are never to be exploited for any commercial means. RGD has its own full set of best practice guidelines specifically about student internships, which are available on the website. I'm not sure precisely where. But professionals and students alike should both familiarize themselves with that document and those expectations. I mean, as a student, you want to make sure that you get the best experience you can possibly get. And as a professional, if you think that you want to offer an internship at the proper educational level, then you should know what to expect and what's going to be, what standard you're going to be held to in order to give that student the best opportunity and also help out your company. So yeah, that's rule number 2 in a nutshell. So I'll throw back to Stüssy for 3.
All right. So rule number 3, Hilary, if you want to switch over. Excellent. I will act in the best interest of my clients and our employers within the limits of these rules. It's kind of should be common sense, but we made sure that it's specified. For instance, as a designer, you get often involved with confidential information, and it's crucial that you handle that confidential information responsibly. What is confidential information? That can be business strategies. It can be obviously work in progress if you're working on a new product design or something like that. It can be organizational structure. It can be production methods. The list is endless. There's a lot of different things that are considered confidential, and some of them apply to the clients that you work on, and some of them apply to the employer that you work for. But either way, the information belongs to either the client or the employer. So obviously it is expected of an RGD in an ethical manner to not share that information with competitors, or even just loosely talk about it or put it on blogs and things like that. And then it can get misconstrued by other people. The second point is about competition, and essentially what that means is don't do an end run. So if you're, for instance, been working on a client at a previous employer, and you're no longer working there, and you want to start working for that client, make sure that this is done in a fair business practice. Depending on the situation, either it's been already a number of years since you've worked there, then it's probably assumed that it's fine. But for instance, if you just left a job to go become a freelancer and now you reach out to that client shortly after, then obviously you would need to get permission from whoever you've met that relationship through in a previous capacity. And the third point is conflict of interest. Obviously, if you're working for one large tech company, for instance, whether that's as a freelancer or as a company, you might not be able to do the same kind of work for another large tech company. So like, for instance, if you work on Apple, you might not be able to work simultaneously on Samsung. Or if you're a freelancer, if you work for one design studio, you may not at the same time be engaged with another design studio as a direct competitor. When in doubt, always check. Open communication and honest communication will always be your safest guideline on that. And that's covering rule number 3. Julian.
Great. No other questions so far, so that's good. So rule number 4, I will strive to act in the best interest of consumers and society. So this one's a little more big picture and far-reaching. It's about accessibility, health and safety, human rights, and sustainability. So to start with accessibility, I mean, do work that is accessible to everyone possible. RGD promotes high accessibility standards, and we've been working recently with the government to create literature for designers on this. The handbook specifically has been available, I think, for a couple of years now, if I'm right, Hilary. And I think they're working on an update to that as well. Part of the way that RGD is trying to, like I said, set high standards and make sure everyone in membership is educated about it. There are some other pretty big obvious topics covered. Don't do design work that promotes hatred or discrimination. Always consider the environmental impact of your work and strive to minimize its footprint. That's an interesting one because a lot of the things that we do are, material and temporary and somewhat wasteful in that regard. So the best a designer can do to always be suggesting the newest and latest and most respectful ways that you can do your work and still respect the environment and minimize your footprint it's good. To go even further, this rule outlines best practices for volunteering your design services. Consider that you could do 5% of all your time and effort could be donated to working for suitable causes or organizations that you want to support. And that's an overview of number 4. Stüssy, back to you.
All right, rule number 5. I will meet financial obligations, respect lawful contracts, and be bound by provisions in all agreements. I think that one is fairly clear right in the actual statement. Similarly to rule number 1, first and foremost, uphold laws and RGD bylaws. Ensure that when you're working with clients or when you hire employees, first of all, ensure that you have a contract, have something in writing. It's more of a best practice than a policy, but at the end of the day, you want to make sure that it's a clear understanding of what you're engaged to do or what you expect of a supplier or an employee to do for you. And be specific in the contract. I know contracts can often be very legally written, and that may need to be the case, but we should also make sure that we help people to actually understand what's in that contract. So if you have a fairly complex document that's written or contract that's written out by a lawyer, walk your client, employee, supplier through it and make sure they understand what actually is in that contract beyond just the really complicated written parts. So there's no surprises, because at the end of the day, if you get to the end of a project or contract or something like that, and there's a disagreement, nobody wants to be in that situation. Not your clients, not your employees. So it's always best to be thorough in explaining and ensuring right at the get-go that everybody understands what's expected, how much they have to pay for a service, how much they get paid for something they do for you, and by when and how this is expected. So basically, have a written form, and it can be sometimes as simple as a half-page document. It doesn't have to be a long contract, but just have something in writing. Verbal agreements are very hard to be enforced later on, because then it's the he said, she said, and at the end of the day, it would be hard to prove anything. So having the written contract will be really what helps you in those situations. Then, as an RGD, it is expected that you follow through on what's in that contract. So if it's an employee contract, that you pay and honor what you promised the employee in that contract. And for clients, if you promise them a certain deliverable at a certain cost, make sure you follow as best as possible through to deliver that. And if there is any uncertainties or changes to the scope, for instance, make sure that's documented again along the way as well. And yeah, I mean, it's again, it comes down to open and honest communication, but also make sure that all key elements are in written form at the end of the day. Time for Julian.
So before we move on, I just wanted to mention a couple slides ago, Julian asked about the internships, and as I mentioned, the document does have links to some additional references. So there is a link in the rules to our best practices for internships, and then in this section also there is a reference to guidelines for a design agreement. It's not a template agreement. We did discuss that with lawyers, but the feeling was it was better to have guidelines, and it is valuable if you you know, kind of create your own template based on some of the documents that are out there and some of these guidelines. It is a good idea to have that vetted by a lawyer, just as a template that you might use. And then every single rule does, in many cases, reference a chapter in our handbook, the Business of Graphic Design, the RGD Professional Handbook, and including having the rules laid out. So it's something, if you're not a member, you could think about getting a copy through us, and if you are an RGD, a provisional RGD or an affiliate RGD, you should have a copy. So.
Perfect. Yeah, it's an extremely useful book, spoken from experience. When I started 5 or more years ago, it was only the first edition of the book, but I referenced this and the previous edition over and over and over again when I was first starting out. And a lot of the forms and stuff and written communication that Stüssy was talking about, there's samples in the back of the book that do a great job of getting you started. Some of them seem a little sort of wide-reaching, but at least it's a place to start, and you can edit it down for your needs if you're just a freelancer starting out. So on to rule number 6. I will ensure I receive compensation for graphic design services that I provide, except for pro bono work. So oh boy, this is a big one. Don't be fooled by the cute little squirrel in this picture. This rule is an absolute monster. And there's a lot to discuss here. This rule outlines that RGD members must be fairly compensated for their design work. So what exactly is fair? Well, we can't assign an exact dollar value, of course. I think people would refer to that as price fixing, but we can agree that $0 is not a fair price for professional work. So this rule helps members identify commercial spec work, as it is commonly called, getting $0, but hoping to get paid after you're done. That's just a really casual definition of spec work, but that's spec in that category, and also about not to participate in the so-called design contests. I'm going to use air quotes there for contests, which is a newer version of spec work, which is quite rampant. And these are the contests. These are the ones that ask for new, original, creative to be done, rather than rewarding existing work, like most prominent design award shows do and properly do, and that's fine. So contests and general spec, most of these, excuse me, both of these practices are very, very harmful to the industry, as well as the clients that we serve, although often they may not realize that. For a variety of reasons, some of which we've talked about and some of which we could talk about for days, RGD is constantly advocating for its members, as well as trying to educate non-members and the public and other members of the business community about this issue. I would say, as the current VP of the Ethics Committee, it's the single largest issue that we deal with on a regular basis. But that's not to say that you should never work for free in general. So there's a very large difference between the spec work that I've just outlined and pro bono work. So this rule also outlines and encourages, volunteering or donating your design work, which is entirely different, like I said, than spec. So this includes things like issuing an invoice for the full amount that's 100% discounted, so that the client that you're working with, whether it's a not-for-profit or a charity or something like that, that communicates the full value of what you've done for them. This is a really important step that I've used myself several times throughout my career. And this helps to reinforce the value of what we do. There's another best practice that's recommended is asking for a visible credit on your designs when you have donated your work. It's a bit of a cue to the rest of the community that how that work was procured and how it was donated. And it also is obviously it's another kind of compensation that's coming back your way to be recognized for the work you've done. If any one section creates questions to be answered, I have no doubt it will be this one. But I'm going to leave it there for now, and we'll move on to rule number 7. I think I just saw a question pop up.
So I think we'll stay right with that for now.
Sure.
Hilary?
Can we handle we've got a new question apparently?
When you have federal bodies running spec-based competitions, how does RGD contend with this and still uphold its position on this?
The federal bodies, I assume that we're making a direct reference to the Canada 150 logo competition and ensuing interesting free font details. I'm not sure how much every single attendee of this webinar might be familiar with what's happened lately with the Canadian government. Talking with the Canadian government is something that RGD has done regularly for years and years. I know Hilary can speak further to that. Doing our best to advocate that the government does not procure design services in this way, asking for the free creative to be done up front, which would in itself be a wasteful and unethical business practice, but instead what they've done this last time around is gone a step further and created a design contest, as I used the air quotes before, specifically targeting and preying on younger designers and students, whether they would admit that or not. That's ultimately what happens, because professionals and RGDs ignore these kinds of, pointless exercises. And what ends up happening is that it tempts in younger members or younger designers. One of the ways that we can do our best to fight this sort of thing from happening, because we're never going to stop it from happening, in the far reaches of the internet and in the deepest, darkest corners. But I think that we can speak loudly and speak proudly when it does happen at this level. So part of what, specifically with the Canada 150 contest, I know RGD was involved in a social media campaign that was trying to, fire back and having students and young designers specifically saying that, this is not something that we want to do. Our time has value was how that campaign was used for this as well. And it's difficult because you want to make as much of a wave as you can to advocate for the issue, get some press, do some interviews, which RGD has done in the past as well. And it's a fine line because there's also a billion other issues facing our federal government. And the attention of the general public and the business community can only go so far and be stretched so thin. So I think it's a really interesting issue where you have to kind of pick your battles, and something like the Canada 150 logo contest was a big one, and RGD did do its best to issue a statement and do some press and advocate on behalf of its members. I don't know if you want to add anything, Hilary or Stüssy? Or...
I wanted to add just, obviously we have over the years tried various methods to advocate with the government. Certainly we have members who work with various Crown corporations and departments, and they have been very helpful in raising awareness of best practices for procuring and working with graphic designers. We had a lobbyist involved with RGD for a while, and specifically in Ottawa related to the low price compliancy. There was a policy for a while, which my understanding is it's not prevalent now, that the government would always select the lowest price when looking at proposals for design projects, no matter the merit of the other elements of the firm or individual's capabilities, and that was a very big situation or issue, challenge for Ottawa designers in particular. So, I mean, there is that one aspect of really advocating and trying to speak to government. It's a bit of a beast, and there's so many departments, and it's both political and bureaucratic, and there's a fair amount of turnover as well, so that can be an issue. But I think what these high-profile situations allow us to do is to raise awareness with the people that really matter, and that's our community, and particularly the students who are the future generation, to understand the issue, understand why participating in these contests is not a worthwhile use of their time, why it is a dangerous precedent for them moving forward into what will ideally be a meaningful and lucrative profession for them and jobs for them, and this was a great opportunity, I think, for us to do that. And I hope that out of a bad situation came an opportunity to really make students feel proud about the work that they do and understand its value. Stüssy, did you want to add anything?
No, I think it's fairly well summed up. The biggest thing is, I think, and it's been said, but just summarizing, educate clients or governments or whoever is asking for this. In some cases, it is a lack of understanding the process behind things. So educate and don't participate. So by them not getting any real designer participating, it will hopefully show them that they're not getting any good results. So basically, if we stand united as an industry, that will strengthen the position that we're taking when we do send out these letters to advocate on behalf of the designers to not run these spec contests. That's all.
Yeah. It's so true. And to educate, like Hilary said, not just the clients and the possible proponents of it, but to educate the young designers and the future of the industry, because they are the ones who will set the precedent for the future going forward. And you know, everybody has a different bar for where they would put this on their ethical scale or whatever. But something that, like, sort of a way you can look at it as a young designer, sort of rule of thumb that I talked about before is, you know, think about it. If you were to be put in one big room with all the other designers doing this or doing something like this, would it feel right? You know what I mean? Part of why it works is because there's the physical isolation that every young designer is in their own space and they're connected digitally. But if you were to line them all up physically in one big space, you would realize how ridiculous it is to have like 1,000 people working on something to only select one and then one person gets paid. Can you imagine a factory floor where 1,000 workers work all day and only one gets paid because they did the best job? You know, obviously not. That would be called slave labor. That would be called something horrible. And you know, we would all be up in arms and running and getting the government to shut it down, right? So, but from a student point of view, you know, if it's for a charity or something, or if you're volunteering your services, you know, like, would you go spoon soup at a soup kitchen with 100 other people to help the charity? Okay, well, that, you know, if you would do that, then doing your design is the same sort of thing. But if you can't picture yourself doing that all, you know, if you can't visualize that, then that's sort of one way to look at it. Anyway, we've been on this for a while. Should we move on to rule number 7?
Yeah. So rule number 7, I will respect the intellectual property rights of others. So there's 4 policies that go under this rule. The first one is don't plagiarize. That goes from school right through to your professional career. Do not copy another designer's work unless, of course, you have consent, if it's something that you work with them in conjunction. And certainly never claim anybody else's work as your own. Now, the time where somebody else's work may come up in conjunction with your name is when you worked in collaboration with somebody, whether that is with your senior art director at the firm you're working at, or if you were part of an in-house team, or as a freelancer working with another company. However, whenever working with other people, give credit where credit is due. So when collaborating or working in a team, make sure when you show the work that you say this was done in collaboration with, and credit the people that were involved on it. Because again, it would be false to say, I designed this logo if you were maybe the junior designer and there was a senior art director involved. But you definitely get a credit as well. So as long as you identify how this came about, then you can show the work and yeah, make sure you give credit to the right people. Then obviously licensing materials. So for instance, when purchasing images or illustrations or things like that, make sure you have the rights to these licenses, whatever that means. Usually that means you have to pay somebody for it. Make sure you get the licenses right off at the beginning of the when you start using the licensing material. And also make sure if you, for instance, let's say you're working on a website for a client and you're using images for that website that are stock images, make sure those licenses get transferred to the end client as well. So they are in hand with the person that actually ends up using the material. There are pretty strict rules about that. So make sure you read the agreements, the licensing agreements, and follow them accordingly. And then the last section is about Creative Commons. So when using materials that are essentially open source or that you can just use, identify the original source and give credit where applicable. And should there be any question about having to pay the originator of the work, get permission from whoever originally created the work. And maybe reach out to them and come to an agreement whether they need to get paid for part of it or they are happy just by being credited by name. But make sure you get something in writing that explains that you're allowed to use this and why you're allowed to use this. And should you not be able to reach an agreement, then you have to stop using that that Creative Commons item. And yeah, it may mean some redesign sometimes. But usually, most people, if they put things up sort of in that Creative Commons domain, they are very willing to work with you to make sure that their work gets used in an appropriate manner. Hilary?
So, yeah, if I could just make an observation here. Over the years, we somewhat regularly have inquiries and concerns raised by members and designers about the issue of plagiarism. And it can be a very tricky and very legal situation. So, I mean, we obviously have a policy against it, but this is a situation for the lawyers and for the courts to really make absolute determinations about. I mean, particularly in the world where so much material is available, it can be easy to find common elements in designs that are that are graphic representations of specific actions or activities, and the fact that they are doesn't necessarily mean that they were plagiarized or that the original design was seen, and particularly with sort of very iconic images, it can be difficult sometimes to know. So I definitely I don't want to be inundated, but I mean, certainly if you have concerns in any of these cases and you are a member, I definitely encourage you to get in touch with me. We will do our best to direct your concern and provide as much information as we have about situations that have been similar in the past, or even just refer you to a lawyer. That may be the only option. But just keep in mind that some of these rules are very legally, they have a lot of legal elements, and ultimately those are going to, that is going to come into play. Just because you think something looks similar, unfortunately neither RGD nor you get to sort of make that final determination.
Good point. So no further questions on this so far. So Julian?
No, not so far. All right. So moving on to rule number 8. I will uphold my intellectual property rights unless I have negotiated transfer of them to another party. So this is sort of the flip side of the coin to what Stüssy just talked about. As an RGD, you're responsible to protect your own intellectual property, respecting its value. So that would be something like charging for its transfer. If you are doing that, it's not just something that gets thrown in. It's something that has a monetary value, which is to be negotiated. And as well as keeping your own rights to promote your own work. In intellectual property law, the term moral rights refers to your right to be associated with the work that you've done, and for it to not be, I'm not sure what the proper term is but adulterated or changed without, still referring back to you. So maintaining your moral rights is usually the default in a transaction between a client and a designer, or an employee and an employer. To be a smart employee would be to not sign an employment contract where you're signing away all of your moral rights to something, because that's you want to have the right to be able to promote your work in the future, in a fully open and transparent and ethical way. So just as you are responsible for your own, you're also responsible to, like Stüssy said, credit everybody involved and be fully honest about how you were involved in something, rather than just putting your own name and kind of making it seem like you did more than you did. So Rule 8 also outlines some best practices for employees and employers about promoting their work, and the key here is during and after working relationships end. So the basic idea that it is up to the former employee to ask for permission when trying to obtain projects and things that they want to have in their portfolio and they want to show as work that they did, and it's up to the employer it's a best practice to provide that and make sure that they properly credit everyone involved and that everybody gets the credit where credit is due at the end of the day. So that's a basic summary of rule number 8.
And I'll just add here, this is another rule where we get a lot of inquiries, particularly from designers who have been employed somewhere. And there's sort of my understanding, and again, I'm not a lawyer, and I think that even lawyers don't like to, my experience is lawyers don't like to provide answers to some of these questions because there's so many nuances, and the specifics of any one situation may determine the answers. So these are I'm just adding some general understanding and a general opinion that I've received from lawyers and through various situations. But my general understanding is that certainly if you are going to promote any work that you did while employed by someone else, you really need to get permission. It seems unfair. I know for a lot of young designers who maybe are still looking and don't want to necessarily have their employee know, or maybe left on not the best terms, or maybe you're just not getting that permission, and that's a very difficult situation. But if you want to show it in a public way on a website, something like that, you really can't do that unless you have that permission. And as Julian mentioned, the best way to go about it is to try to get that permission at the outset. So maybe just tell when you're getting a job or at any point early on in a relationship, say I like to show off the work that I do on my own personal website, on a blog, and hopefully you sort of address that at the beginning. And of course, as Julian said, making sure that your specific role is outlined and that any others involved in the creation of the work are credited in any situation. Now, this is very different than showing your work on a one-on-one basis or sending a PDF of your portfolio to a specific person. In those situations, again, if you do provide credit for where you did the work, what your role was, what your specific responsibilities were, my understanding from some of the events that we've done where lawyers have spoken or answered this question is that it is reasonable for you to be doing that, as long as it's that sort of one-on-one or it's very personal. It's not like you're taking credit in the public realm for someone for another company's work. But just to keep in mind those differences, and again, when you do have very specific concerns, that is something, and you are a member, that is something that we're there to help with.
Excellent. I don't know, we don't seem to have any further questions at this point. I just sort of in summary wanted to point something out. I've heard people make comments in the past like why do we have these rules? Like why does the organization tell people what to do? But I think now that we've gone over them, it should be pretty clear to everybody. It's really not like unreasonable rules. It's more clarifying like the way things should be done anyhow by any reasonable person. So I think to me that's always been the big thing. It's a nice place to have sort of a summary of all these things that we should be doing anyhow without like having to be told to basically be ethical and work honest, etc. So I think I hope that the session today helped everybody to understand that part a little better, that this is really a lot of it should be common sense, and unfortunately it isn't always. So that's why we figured this is a good way to explain a little further how this played out.
Yeah, and that the RGD rules are not something that RGD is trying to go around the world policing or enforcing, nor can we, nor should we. And being involved in RGD, being a member, is about standing together and saying we are better. This is how we practice, and these are the standards that we hold ourselves to, and that's one of the reasons why you want to be a member.
Yeah, and I'll just add too. I mean, I think that ideally, I mean, it's been 17 years now that I've been with RGD, and I think there's a big difference now. I think in terms of the awareness of us and our importance to the community, I'd like to think. But I still have many members and non-members who say, oh, nobody knows what RGD is. I bring it up, and they don't know what that is. And I think it's important that the rules and the association offers our members an opportunity to talk about the value and the meaning of what it is, of what RGD is. And I think the rules are a really important part of that, because it's a way to have a conversation with clients and employers that you care about this, you care about behaving ethically, you understand and really have thought about your responsibilities as a designer, and through the RGD you're both connected to an organization that supports you in that attitude, in those beliefs, and is there to maybe step in if there's concern about behavior that maybe is not ethical, and to really hold the members a bit to account for that. So I think that we sort of tried to make the document a little bit less legalistic than in previous versions, and trying to make sure that it is something that you could maybe show to a client, that, or even just an outline of the 8 rules, that this is a bit of who you are, and this is something that can make them feel good about working with you, because you have that extra concern and awareness of how to behave ethically.
Okay, great. Well, I'd like to thank Hilary, Julian, and yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I think there's just a question that came in.
Oh, sure. Okay, I'll read it out to you guys here. Any resources to do a media buy to educate designers, industry, and buyers of design services like accounting bodies do?
So Nicholas referring to the large billboards on the Gardner Expressway about chartered accountants.
There are slightly different budgets, unfortunately, in play for like some of these organizations versus the RGD. So I believe there was a media placement years and years ago. No, Hilary? I thought there was at some point like a newspaper ad or something like that was pulled out to educate people, but
not for a biz. I mean, we obviously do advertising that's in kind in design publications, and we've had some sponsorship from Marketing Magazine in the past. But generally, I mean, we've looked at ads, and trust me, we've definitely tried very hard to get media sponsorship from the big papers and the business press. It unfortunately has just not ever been possible, and you have no idea how, well, I'm sure actually probably a lot of you do, but I had no idea how much something like a one-page ad in you know, Canadian Business or Profit, which I don't think really exists anymore as a magazine, but I mean, how much something like that would cost just for a one-time small page ad. And I don't also know how necessarily relevant it would be to the larger business audience who are very specific. So, I mean, we've focused a little bit more on partnerships and more general awareness. So things like the Design Thinker of the Year, hopefully, are helping to, and the media roundtable that we did, helping to just raise awareness of the value of Canadian design. And then specific partnerships, always working to try to make inroads into the marketing associations. But we've had a lot more success with IABC. So we have a lot of partnerships with the International Association of Business Communicators, participating in their events, distributing materials at their events, and promoting what we do and who we are to their members. And in particular, we actually have a couple programs coming up with the IABC Toronto chapter, which is the largest IABC chapter in the world. We're going to be doing a series of 3 webinars, and that's the other aspect that I want to mention, that sort of like those partnerships, but then also about education and support and value than just about awareness or, you know, you need to hire us. So the webinars are going to cover the sort of best practices for buyers of design to work with designers. So we'll have one on developing creative brief, designer-client creative brief, one on the importance of branding and brand stewardship and brand consistency for an organization, and then a third on measuring design's effectiveness. So understanding both at the outset of a project and throughout and at the end, how to create a process and a result that you can measure and really understand. So those are just, and then we hope to have an actual panel event in June. So just a little bit about what we have in mind, and certainly if you have ideas for or want to get more involved, we have a PR committee that meets regularly to look at ways to effectively and with the limited resources that we have to be able to reach out to the business community and the public. So you are encouraged, if you are a member, to get involved in that way.
Sure.
I guess that sums it up nicely.
Okay, great. Well, I'd like to thank the three of you, Hilary, Julian, and Stüssy, for hosting today's webinar. We really appreciate you taking the time to present this content to us today, so thanks very much. And before we sign off, just a quick reminder that RGD organizes regular free virtual events for our members. On January 21st, Mark O'Brien will share a presentation called Community Projects, a framework to build impact. And on January 28th, Alex and Dan from Blur will present a webinar on making beautiful books and magazines for clients, large and small. So visit rgd.ca for a full list of upcoming webinars and other events. And this concludes today's webinar. Thank you all for your participation.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.